I have a particular nostalgia for lakeside retro horror. 1981's The Burning is to me the type of film that all slashers should strive to be like. It is one of those rare pinnacle films of a subgenre that represents what this type of thing can really be. It is a timeless and technology-free location that lives idealized in the minds of everyone who experienced this type of place as a child. And we each as audience members bring our own special memories to these works that may or may not all have been that happy. I think that most people who did a summer camp experience were probably actually kind of miserable at least 30% of the time that they were there. But in our minds, this becomes this idealized liminal place built on half-remembered details. The summer camp slasher, to me, plays into that clash between a special childhood moment that cannot be relived, that now can only be visited within our past, and the darkness of the human nature that thrives in environments like that which may go unnoticed. Hey campers, how you doing? Today we've gathered around the fire to discuss 1983's iconic film Sleepaway Camp, and the sequels that then spawned from it, as well as the pretty complicated legacy that it has built for itself. The first film tells the story of two campers, Angela and her cousin Ricky, who are being sent by her aunt and his mother, Martha, to spend the summer at Camp Arawak, where children ranging from middle to high school gather every single year. Except, this year, something is different, as it seems one of the boys secretly has murderous intent in his heart, and begins to kill off the fellow campers as well as some of the staff. Angela, being the shy girl that she is forced to navigate the complicated relationships of these brief summer friendships that will soon end just as suddenly as they began, while trying to avoid the danger lurking within the shadows. All the while, the camp manager, Mel, tries to cover up the murders that continue to escalate in number and grow out of control out of a fear of it ruining the reputation of his camp, as it all builds to a violent night so horrible that we are still talking about it here 42 years later. There are a lot of threads being dealt with in this movie, a major one being the uncomfortable fact that adults will not always act appropriately when left unsupervised around children. A taboo subject, but also a true one. A dark aspect of life that sadly happens all too often and goes unpunished more than it should. It is something that appears to some degree or another in basically each of these films in this series, where they take this wholesome setting built on fondness from our youth and show it in a light not tinted by rose glasses, which to an extent is all horror, but I think is done particularly well here. The adults who work in the camp are all sleazy. It has an overall unpleasantness and gross perverse atmosphere. The whole thing is just covered in a thick layer of textured grime. One of my absolute favorite shots in this is when the cook is about to be killed, and we get this great POV shot from the killer's perspective, and the back of his pants are just incredibly filthy. Like every other decade, the first years of the 1980s were not truly yet the 1980s, but instead were an epilogue to the 1970s. And this was reflected in many of the works of media of that day, including Sleepaway Camp. The filmic style, the score, the clothes, set decoration, and even the font used for the title credits all scream 70s thriller. And that's not a bad thing. But if you haven't seen this and go into it expecting a wild 80s slasher romp, then you might leave a bit disappointed, as this comes from that tail end of the first major post-Halloween phase of the slasher boom, where things had yet to get super outrageous like they would by the end of the 1980s, and instead goes for a more grounded and uncomfortable atmosphere. For how big some of its moments can be, Sleepaway Camp is for most of its runtime somewhat understated, a character drama accented by minor notes of horror throughout. If you were to show people who have never seen this movie a random scene from it, they probably would not suspect that it was actually supposed to be from a horror film, but that leaves it having this strange, grounded, naturalistic tone to the piece that overall works, and makes the moments of unpleasantness that invades this rumination of a time from when we were much younger all the more impactful. Those moments of horror that are here sell the picture, and are rightfully what it is remembered for with its weirdly intense nightmare violence. The best moments of cinematography are saved for these shots focusing on the savage nature of the killings, and still to this day hold a strange, shocking feel to them. The anguished reaching hand casting two shadows, the stabbed wall gushing blood, a beehive which decimates a man in seconds, the crackling skin of the cook after being covered in boiling water, the snake slithering staring out of the discovered body's mouth, which still to this day is one of the most unpleasant cuts in horror film history. These moments account for maybe 5% of what Sleepaway Camp's runtime is. It is far from an overly violent affair, but when it goes there, no expense is ever spared. And when reflecting on this, you will probably remember Sleepaway Camp as being a much more violent film than it actually is because they sell those moments so hard. What the film is primarily known for, as you probably know, is that as a work it has the reputation of being a queer cult classic, and this is for several different layers within the film. Many of the performances, most notably the aunt portrayed by Desiree Gould, are extremely campy and over the top in their delivery. The film also somewhat represents an inverse of the lens on nudity that contrasts other works of this era, similarly to how Nightmare on Elm Street 2 operates. The 1980s in particular is a time known for a great deal of feminine nudity, used primarily to attract a younger male high school and college audience. If you've seen any film from this period of time like this, especially in horror, then you've probably noticed that there exists at least one scene in each of these that only exists to show off the body of one or more of the women in the film. It's that Danny Trejo method of the 4 B's that are needed to have a successful box office in trash films: bullets, blades, blood, and breasts. But that isn't Sleepaway Camp. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. In the rare instances of female nudity in this, it is filmed from a much more prudish and sensitive lens than you would find in other contemporary works. These shots are done like a Dove soap commercial. Even the bodies of the women are not highlighted in other scenes, where more often than not their clothes tend to be baggy. As entities, they are largely unsexed throughout the film, not just in the way that they are physically displayed for the camera, but also in how they have little to no desire for sex from the boys at the camp. The men and the boys, however, are displayed how women normally would be, often shirtless, shorts incredibly short and tight. If they do have shirts, then they will often be midriff, casually, comfortably being nude around each other while both swimming as well as in their private quarters, and just, out and about in the camp itself. They make the joke of rubbing their naked asses on a person's bare face. They are presented through a liberated and free perspective, one that is voyeuristically sexual in nature, and also one that is not necessarily saying that this is a good thing. This could be very straightforward, and it very well may be that they just desired to shoot the men like this. But to play devil's advocate, I think an argument could be made that Sleepaway Camp is a very sex-negative film, and that this was being done not to entice people, but instead to kind of upset them. A presentation of casual nudity which was potentially being done to build a social fear within the audience members, to possibly create a feeling of gay panic uncomfortableness, which I think there's evidence to support this argument within the film itself. Not all representation is done out of kindness. These shots are, in my mind, thematically resonant with the end of the film, and are almost certainly here to provoke a somewhat feeling of revulsion from the general audiences of the 1980s. A subconscious social horror to highlight the physical horror of the violence. And as I already said, really one of the only other prominent slasher films like it is Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which has a similar history and legacy of being made through homophobic intentions, but has been reevaluated and reclaimed in different light decades later. But really, what the film is known for is its ending. So all summer, Angela has been having an on-again, off-again crush with this boy at the camp named Paul. But every time they get close to being intimate, Angela gets shy and rejects Paul's advances. But one night she tells him to meet her down by the lake, the same night as the height of the violence has escalated within the camp. And we see her later that night nude in the sand, Paul's head resting gently in her lap as she strokes his hair, only for the adults to stumble upon them and take the couple by surprise. Angela leaps to her feet, hisses a horrible animalistic sound, and stands up to reveal that Paul's head is no longer attached to his body and that Angela has a penis. This is made all the more complicated by information that we are given in flashback. The following is all that we know about Angela's past. 8 years previously, John and Lenny took their children Peter and Angela on a boating trip to a lake. In a horrible accident, Angela, Lenny, and John all died, and Peter was sent to live with his Aunt Martha, who had always wanted to have a little girl and did not want to raise another boy. And so she forcibly made Peter transition and take up the identity of his dead sister, Angela. There's another flashback where it is implied that Peter and Angela experienced trauma from seeing their fathers in bed together, and all of this has seemingly brought on a murder spree of anger taken out on the campers around her. So we have this character who is kind of trans, but also kind of isn't because it was done so out of force. Although Angela by this point seems to moderately accept and be comfortable within this identity that has been thrust upon her, and no longer outwardly rejects it in small social situations. But also still is clearly uncomfortable with her body, as she does not want Paul to see her nude and learn the truth about her. And even ends up killing him for reasons that we do not know, but we can assume is done to keep her secret. We do not know how she actually sees herself, if she identifies as a girl or a boy or somewhere in between, because Angela has almost no dialogue within the film. She is an entity that we perceive but do not actually get to know. And we see that she is killing for some reason, and we can assume it is related to that, and so her interest in Paul certainly verges on being possibly a queer one in itself, which also isn't great because they may be implying that Angela may be the way that she is because of her relationship to her dead gay fathers. We are given a lot of information, but none of it is really explained or contextualized in any satisfying way. And then the film just ends with us being hit with Angela's horrible, screaming, frozen, traumatized face. Credits roll. It is important to note that Felicia Rose, who plays Angela, is not, to my knowledge, trans, and is also not actually in this final sequence. The reason this shot is so uncanny and awful to look at is because they got a man to pose nude for it wearing a mask based on her face that had these lifeless eyes painted onto it, but a gaping hole where the mouth should be, so that he could emote while wearing it. The effect is so convincing that you'd never think when watching this that it isn't her, but internally you just know that you are looking at something that is completely wrong. There's just subtle facial hints that make this read as totally unhuman, and as a result is one of the most impactful moments in the entire history of horror cinema. Now, personally, I am fully in the camp of thinking that no matter how this is seen retroactively today, there is no other way to spin it other than to say plainly that Sleepaway Camp absolutely, in my mind, was made with the intention of being a homophobic, gay panic shock piece like many others of its kind, ranging from Psycho, Dressed to Kill, and Silence of the Lambs. I don't think that there is actually a single pro-queer frame within this piece, and if anything, I think that Sleepaway Camp could be successfully argued to be a quite hateful movie. There's no other way to look at it in my eyes. It has certainly been reclaimed, but let's not kid ourselves that this exploitation B movie with that ending is anything other than what it seems upon the surface, which is to be hateful and have a shocking transgressive ending against queer people. It's a gay fear-mongering jump scare. That also doesn't mean that I don't like it. I've always loved Sleepaway Camp. It certainly doesn't mean that it isn't interesting or compelling, if at least even accidentally so, and has for a number of reasons cemented the film as being extremely important, both within the landscape of horror, as well as just within queer cinema, which may possibly be confusing to some. If given the most generous of readings, I think that Sleepaway Camp might be better understood, if thought of as the trashier cousin to Ian Banks' novel from the following year, The Wasp Factory, where, spoilers if you've not read it, our narrator Frank learns that he is not who he thinks he is, or was raised to be, that is. His father, a man spurned by the same woman twice who left him with 2 children to raise, was radicalized and became an extremist in his views on misogyny. He takes his baby girl Frances, and raises the child to be a boy named Frank. He rejects everything feminine in the world around him and cannot bring himself to raise a daughter. He forces Frank to take hormone injections and keeps him from the outside world, homeschooling him and telling him that he was mauled by a dog as a small child that mutilated his genitals. He says that the surgeons did the best that they could, but that they were not very successful, which is why he looks different from the other boys. It is a novel about someone experiencing gender dysphoria over lies that have been told to them about themselves, about false contradictions and artifices that a parent has constructed within a child's life that don't actually align with their actual internalized self-identity. And through this, frustration and ultimately great violence is manifested. To Frank, the lack of being able to participate in traditional sexual rituals as he sees them presents itself in his psyche as new religious actions and ceremonial violence that he takes against animals, and then eventually to children, and then women, as a way to prove his physical innate warrior manhood that he feels that he has to embody, both to himself and to the world around him based on this falsehood of identity that has been placed upon him that does not actually align with how he feels about himself. If Frank cannot control women sexually, then it must be done through violence and force, all of which are things that he learns through the actions of his father. The parent figures in both The Wasp Factory as well as in Sleepaway Camp reject an ideology or perceived lifestyle or way of being so harshly that they took a child and tried to mold them to fit a political idealization of their own beliefs, and from that, violence was unleashed on those around them that came out of a conflict of how they feel not matching with how they are told to be. That identity clash within themselves explodes into outwardly expressed violence. And in that light, Sleepaway Camp is an incredibly queer film. Every queer person to some degree has faced an adult in their life who tried to steer them to be more straight presenting in some way, to force them to adjust their personality and outward expression and way of being to better fit into a more presentable, agreeable, or acceptable fashion that fit more cleanly within the boundaries of established gender roles and straight heteronormative lifestyles, even if at just large family gatherings or holidays. Every queer child has been asked at some point to change their clothes because they're embarrassing either their family or someone in their life with power just for existing and being honest to who they are as a person. I know that I have been asked to change my clothes because I was told that everyone who saw me would be uncomfortable or embarrassed that I was dressing like that, which was, as we all know, ultimately a projection of their own fear of being seen in public with a visibly queer person, that they are then forcing to conform to an identity that is not true to who they are for the comfort and pleasures of others around them. The fear of an adult taking you and forcing you to be something that you are not is something that every queer kid has had to deal with, or keep at the back of their mind. So if you've ever wondered why a movie as homophobic as Sleepaway Camp is, at the same time is loved by the queer community, to a degree I think it is partially this. But it is a complicated issue that has been talked about both positively and negatively from people who both are and are not queer. You could get an entire book out of the different perspectives that people have about this movie and its importance on media history, which I think in and of itself is a sign that it is an important work of art, just due to the conversations that it has provoked for decades. So to boil Sleepaway Camp's legacy down to a singular thought would be overly simplistic and disingenuous to the evolving conversation that has been happening around this work, and the very concepts of gender and expression for the past 4 decades. Like many other things based on us that were not necessarily done out of kindness, such as, say, Disney villains, it has at the very least been an important part of our shared media culture as queer people. And for that reason, it is one of the most important horror films of that decade, and is one that conversation will be continued to surround for years to come. Now, the argument could be made that Sleepaway Camp is such a singular idea to the degree that it is probably too narrow to support a franchise off of it. That, like many other horror properties, it might should have been left as a single cult movie, as evident by the recent failings of Megan 2.0, that tried and then failed to recapture that magic that the first outing had. Although I admit to being in the minority there and thinking that it was actually much better than the first one was. But surprisingly, 1988's Sleepaway Camp 2: Unhappy Campers ends up being one of the best slasher films of the 1980s by my money. For me personally, right here is actually the high point of the series, and is the rare type of film that is, at least on an entertainment level, more enjoyable than the first entry. There's a lot less to say about it this time around, but I think the average person would actually enjoy this movie more than they would the original. But before we get to that, if you've ever enjoyed my work and would like to support me on Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/praiseofshadows. There you can get early access to all of my work and input on some future projects that I take on. Today I would like to thank D. Oberg, Daniel Meyer, Daniel Perrone, David Thornwaite, Diabolic Model Works, Died Famous, DQ, Dr. Skeletal 3D, and M. Lin. At only 80 minutes in runtime, Sleepaway Camp 2 is short in the best way possible, and delivers on an extremely fun and self-aware premise. Movies like this are the precursor to what Scream would be in the next decade. Even the poster for the film shows Angela with a backpack full of other slasher monsters' gear. And when you see this, you know exactly what you're in for here, and you get it. If you go into this hoping for more Sleepaway Camp, then you're gonna be disappointed. This is an entirely different beast altogether. But if you approach it as, say, the Texas Chainsaw 2 of this franchise, then I think you'll find that there's a lot to love here. The film in general is just totally pop culture obsessed. Every character in the film is named after a prominent figure in youth film at the time. Molly for Molly Ringwald, Sean is Sean Penn, Ali Sheedy, TC for Tom Cruise, Uncle John is John Hughes, Mayor Winningham, Rob Lowe, Demi Moore, Leah Thompson, Brooke Shields, Jodie Foster, Anthony Michael Hall, Judd Nelson, Charlie Sheen, Phoebe Cates, Amelia Estevez, and Diane Lane are all referenced at some point. It is a film made in the 80s about the current culture of the 80s, and while it doesn't end up having a whole lot to say about this, it's still fun to see as just a bizarro cultural remnant. The story for this entry, which takes place some ambiguous time after the first, finds a more adult, outgoing, and personal Angela, running her own sleepaway camp. This time played by Pamela Springsteen, the younger sister to Bruce Springsteen, in one of her only screen acting roles. Which I think is a real shame, as normally recasting main characters is a sign of doom for a project's quality and artistic vision. And while Felicia Rose is iconic in her portrayal of Angela, I actually appreciate what Springsteen is doing with the character, and would say that she is mostly giving a better performance in here than Rose gave in that first film. I would have loved to have seen this launch a decades-spanning genre film career for her like the first one did for Rose, but that unfortunately did not happen. She at the time was worried about people thinking that she got the role because of her famous sibling, to the point that she didn't even tell anyone that he was her older brother, including those who worked on the film itself, many of which did not actually learn the truth until years after they had filmed together. From what I've read, they actually did ask Rose to come back and read for the part, which she did, but it was agreed upon for whatever reason that she wouldn't be the right fit for the quirky one-liner direction that they were wanting to take with the character. In this, Springsteen brings this Bugs Bunny energy to the project that is not all that different from Martha's energy in the first one, where, now filling the role of main character, we watch as she one by one knocks out the teenagers of her camp in gloriously goofy ways. There's not much of a story here beyond what we just covered, which to some that may be an issue, and that's valid. But I would argue that for something like this, you really don't entirely need that. It's a hangout movie. We just spend time with Angela as she does unrepentingly garish, horrible things. We laugh with her, and then the whole thing's over before it overstays its welcome. And there's just something to be said for doing a simple concept really well, and competently delivering a popcorn horror film that just works. There are some other complaints that I have here though, which while ultimately don't really matter, hold the film back in certain aspects for me. Because in some ways this does fail in being a proper sequel to the first film, in ways that are worth pointing out. While beaten to near death by Mel at the end of the last movie, her cousin Ricky does indeed survive that encounter but is nowhere to be seen here. And the same could be said for her Aunt Martha as well, which I think is a bigger issue. Both of them just seemingly do not exist within the reality that this film takes place in. In about 1 minute of screen time, Gould delivered one of the most memorable and iconic performances in all of film history. She effortlessly just oozes camp. And if you're going to be doing a comedic sequel to that first movie, then not including a Martha subplot again is kind of a strange decision to make. And I think she could have really been utilized well here. Desiree Gould should have been a massive cult film star. She could have been a Divine, a Pat Ast, an Edith Massey, a Jennifer Coolidge, a Little Nell, a Ruth Gordon, a Joan Crawford, but she really wasn't. She seemingly couldn't find acting work in the 80s and became a real estate agent instead, only ever appearing in 4 movies in total. They had such a vivid paintbrush in their toolset and they never used it, and I think that's a real shame. One of the biggest shames in cult film history. She could have been such a star. Sleepaway Camp 2 could have been a vehicle for her as a primary antagonist for Angela to get revenge on. Or they could have teamed up and had their crazies bounce off each other. There's just so many different directions that they could have gone there. And the fact that they didn't open the door to that and did nothing with that angle from the first movie is something that just sits at the back of my mind constantly in these sequels. But in this mindset, Sleepaway Camp 2 admittedly does a good job in trying to start a franchise while also attempting to be a somewhat sequel to the first film. And in this, it essentially ignores Angela's backstory completely outside of the intro to the movie that recaps the first story. You know, I do think that representation is important. To a degree, I think all forms of representation in history are important to examine. Even ones that are created out of hate or ignorance or a time that has passed, as a way to a means of understanding the culture of that day and how harmful ideologies are created. but it was probably a smart idea on the part of the filmmakers to mostly just ignore the implications of that shock twist ending of the first one, in favor of making basically a series of Leprechaun-styled cozy slashers that could hopefully be pumped out year after year for essentially no budget, that would in return generate massive amounts of cash. And anything that they included here about Angela's queerness would have almost certainly been mean-spirited, and would have aged the film about as much or even more than the first Sleepaway Camp has already aged itself. So in this, there's no mention of Angela being trans really whatsoever. I suppose she's still supposed to be, because other things from the first movie are still canon. But from here on, after the intro for the film, that is an aspect that is totally dropped from the franchise. The other smart thing that they do here, aside from not really addressing the previous film's twist, is not trying to up that twist with another crazy misdirection. There's no twist here at all. Everything is very straightforward, but that also works for the kind of B-level film that they're trying to make here. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and there's nothing wrong with that. The intro, which functions as kind of its own cold open short film, could in all honesty probably have been cut except for the fact that it would have then brought the film down to be about 75 minutes. It finds a group of campers at a different camp setting around a fire telling stories, and one of them tells the legend of Angela, and what happened all those years ago back at Camp Arawak. Which, serves as both a refresher to the first film if you've not seen that in a while, or a synopsis if you never saw it in the first place. And in being the only outwardly queer section of this movie, it is interesting for me as the characters around the fire are all kind of written to represent different values and viewpoints of this time of Reagan's America. I mean, none of them have aged well. In fact, the whole segment is pretty dehumanizing in the transphobic language that it is using. But one could potentially argue that there is an attempt at a dialogue that, while still tinged with shock-based content, is still at least trying to somewhat explore some of the evolving conversations of gender with the limited language of the 1980s. So this girl tells the story of Angela, and the others want to know what happened to her after she's found nude on the beach holding Paul's head, to which one of the boys says, she's still alive, to which another boy says, it's a guy, to which the first boy says, not anymore. He went into a psych ward a couple of years ago, and while he was there the doctors gave him a sex change, and our parents' taxes paid for it. Well, he, or she, or whatever, got out a couple of years ago. So there's a few things in here that I find interesting. In particular, the very Reagan-era fear of people using social services to receive healthcare treatment. In particular, gender-affirming care treatment, which obviously is something that Americans at large have still not gotten over, as evident by the Republican obsession of so-called illegals using the Medicaid system, with a hatred of brown people that is so extreme that they are willing to cut anyone off of government financial aid programs in order to spite them. These deeply evil roots within our country are long-standing, and I find that interesting to see represented here within this film. After this intro, Angela is just presented as a woman who works at this camp and essentially runs it. Her being trans is never really mentioned again outside of one point late in the film where she mentions that she had gotten an operation. And if it were not for the intro and the relationship to the first film, there isn't anything substantial within the story that would suggest anything about Angela's past at all. But the queerness inherent to the franchise does still linger under the surface, even though it is not an overt plot point this time around. Its ghosts can be still felt throughout. The girls in their dorm hang out nude with each other and playfully discuss their bodies. Angela, who is running the camp and thus is in charge of them, tells them that they shouldn't be so open around each other, and are required to wear clothes when even in their private quarters. That, in her words, nice girls don't have to show it off. A play on the idea we are going for here, that famously in films like Friday the 13th, people who express their sexuality freely, or enjoy the casual physical intimacy of people that they have just met, are quickly responded to with a punishment in the form of a violent death. It is a parody of that and other works of its time based around morality-obsessed killers such as The Stepfather. Angela here in this is the exaggerated character of what the killers in those films represented on an ideological level. Over the course of the film, she kills any camper that she feels is not 100% morally pure, who goes against her personal views of innocence that a young person should have, who violates her own standards, which results in a comedy where she just kills so many kids that it ends with a camp where Angela's just by herself, being the only person left alive by the end. And they could have done something here about relating it to how her childhood was stolen from her, how she was forced to inhabit a body that she did not desire, and as such has a warped perspective about how adolescence should be, and how certain behaviors should be treated. But they never really go there with it thematically. Her hypocrisy-based identity, where she plays the role of judge, jury, and executioner, but also wants everyone to just get along, is so rigid and black and white that it results in a world where every single person who is not just like her is deserving of death. And since no one is quite like anybody else, then everybody in Angela's eyes has got to go. It is a stepping stone in escalation of parody horror comedies, to the excellent Serial Mom 5 years later, which perfected the concept of this ludicrous type of nice, kind, and sweethearted yet hyper-violent character. In private, the girls make fun of her prudishness, saying that they think that she is, in their own words, probably a dyke. These casual changing and shower scenes were almost certainly intended to be Roger Corman style by the filmmakers, to be arousing primarily for the male audience members, as were essentially every titty scene in the 1980s, but not all that unlike exploitation films like Reform School Girls, and almost accidental commentary can be found here in reflection to the Reagan 80s. But again, this is not what this film is about at all, and really is only included with the conversation about the content of 2 because it is so synonymous with the first entry, as this really is just a package of goofy kills. And some would hate it for that, but by my money, I think that so many of these are just really fun. And this has just been a regular comfort watch for me for a good while now. And if you meet it at its level, I think you may be surprised to learn that this probably does not actually deserve the negative reception that it still has to this day. But in relation to this though, beyond that, what else is there to say? This is a film that is entering and prototyping that style of predominantly 90s videotape era fun B-movie rental trash that isn't trying to do or say anything other than to entertain teenagers who rented it for the night. And in that regard, it is an extremely successful work that showed that Sleepaway Camp did have the potential to be franchised into a series with legs if handled properly. But unfortunately, the next year they released Sleepaway Camp 3: Teenage Wasteland, which should have been a similar knockout, and somehow it just isn't. It began production on the exact same set only 3 days after the production of 2, with the same writer, director, and crew to save money. So by that logic, this one should have similarly been pretty great. But for some reason, the stars just did not align here, and these people, within the span of several weeks, made one of the most fun slashers of the 1980s, and a sequel that is just barely watchable. I think what is going on here is that it is probably true that they just spent all their gas on making 2, and by the time it came to make 3, they were tired and were running on fumes, and also probably had to do a rush job with the script in order to shoot this one at the same time as 2. It's not actually all that terrible of a movie. It is the definition of serviceable. In fact, at times is quite fun and has 1 or 2 highs that are higher than those of 2. It tries to have that same energy to it, but most everything it does is just slightly worse than their first attempt. 3 does have a bit of a bad reputation, which is fair, but does have a few things going for it. This definitely is the most camp that the series will ever get. It feels like it was a film directed by Aunt Martha from the first one. We are essentially in full Looney Tunes mode by this point. I mean, the first scene of the movie is Angela running a girl who is going to summer camp over with a stolen tractor-trailer truck so that she can steal her identity and impersonate her at the camp. I love the camera pan as this happens to the giant spray paint on the wall proclaiming Angela's return to summer camp slang. It's just so fucking good. You have a little of that funny commentary on horror in this one, but not a lot of it, and what is here just rings kind of hollow. The Jason mask that gets pulled out of the lake, the date of the film, which takes place on Saturday the 14th, stuff like that. In the beginning, it does play with form in some fun ways though. We are at the same physical location as the last time, but it is no longer the exact same camp, as after Angela's murder spree, the camp was sold and then turned into Camp New Horizons. A news crew is on the scene to do a piece on the opening of the camp in the aftermath of the previous slaughter, and this acts as a meta-commentary on the structure of movies themselves, in particular slashers. The news anchor literally says, "Now let's meet the kids," and we get a quick series of one-liners from all the main cast that are all walking cliches who will be dispensed of quite shortly. It's clever, and shows that maybe if given more time in the oven, they could have really cooked something here. But unfortunately after this, it loses all semblance of anything that could be described remotely as a plot, which isn't all bad. Plot is vastly overrated, I think. A movie can get by with some great vibes alone easily. But in particular with franchise filmmaking, I think a new entry should at least attempt to justify its existence with, some sort of new thing that it brings to the table with a familiar concept. That is the whole ball game there, and this movie has the least obvious point of existence out of all of the entire series. So we have Angela, who has for some reason again returned to a summer camp, probably just for the thrill of it at this point. The camp gets broken down into 3 teams, and each of them go off on their own to a sub-camp off within the woods. Angela starts in the first group, kills everyone there, then moves on to the next group and does the same thing, and then moves on to the last group to do it once more where she will meet her fatal end. And that's that. Credits roll. It is about as bare bones as this kind of concept can be, and when that is the case, you're really relying on 2 things. 1, how fun the kills are, and 2, how good the cast is at doing a lot with a nothing script. And in execution, this does end up being a slightly more fun time than you would think it would be. But it also leaves a product where there's just basically nothing to say about it. The kills are pretty decent. Everyone knows that they're in an awful movie, and so they're just hamming it up. Nobody is going for greatness here. And the color grading in the woods gives the film an amazing fall feeling, which makes me personally feel nostalgic for camping from when I was younger. I love the glazed over look in Angela's eyes after she takes an axe to the stomach. It's such a great visual to end this era of the series on. So there are some good things here. We're left on a cliffhanger where Hannibal Lecter style, she takes out all the people in this ambulance on the way to the hospital, leaving a potential door open for a 4th film starring Springsteen, which sadly would never happen. And I do mean that when I say sadly. I would have loved for this film to be a success, and then come back with a few more sequels that they had more time and budget for. And specifically with Springsteen's Angela, I think that they had something really special here, and kind of wasted an opportunity there. I don't think that she has ever gotten her flowers for this take on the character like she should have. In 1992, they briefly shot footage for a proposed 4th film in the franchise, this time starring Carrie Chambers as Angela instead of Rose or Springsteen. But after just a few days, the company that had funded the shoot went bankrupt, and all plans for a sequel were shelved indefinitely. And it wouldn't be until another 16 years before we saw anything new from the franchise. 2008's Return to Sleepaway Camp is an unusual movie. Filmed in 2003 but not released for another 5 years due to unfinished digital effects. It can almost be seen as an early attempt at what would become the modern legacy horror sequel. And the reason it came about is also pretty funny. So, after making the first film, the writer and director Robert Hiltzik decided to leave film and went on to be a lawyer, and in the following decades was seemingly completely unaware that his only movie had gone on to be a cult video hit. He had just assumed that it had died and been forgotten until he was contacted in the early 2000s by Anchor Bay Entertainment, who was handling the first DVD release of the film and wanted him to record a commentary track for it. Wanting to then capitalize on the cult hit's success, he wrote a new film that began filming in the summer of 2003 that was to be a direct sequel to the original, bringing back a fair amount of cast members from that to now play adult versions of themselves working at the camp. This is filmed in such a way that these roles are not given any significance or reverence like they typically would be in one of these kinds of legacy sequels. And it can totally go over your head that these are supposed to be the same characters all grown up, played by the same actors. It really drops the ball hard there in ways that is kind of fascinating through sheer incompetence. Everyone in this movie kind of feels like how Max von Sydow did in Force Awakens, where if you haven't seen these movies in a while, you have no idea if this person was or was not actually in the originals, based on how they're being framed within the narrative. So I'm not actually entirely sure if it is or not, and in all likelihood it probably isn't, especially if you're counting something like Halloween H2O. But there's a chance that this is the first modern horror sequel to ignore all the other sequels that spawned from that first movie, while also being made decades later and bringing back most of the original cast. If it's not the first, then it certainly is one of the first to do that thing that would be popularized with the Blumhouse Halloween later. And at the very least, this is an outlier in this decade that was more or less preoccupied with doing its own new thing, rather than being focused on a reverence for these older legacy franchise, which saw very few new releases in the early 2000s. But for whatever reason, even though it is a direct sequel to the first film, it is not canon to parts 2 or 3. But that being said, a great deal of the characters in this share names with characters from those 2 films. And this might have just been, a total 100% accident. But if I was going to do a full-on reboot, I would have avoided doing that personally. Is it good? Far from it. But it is extremely bizarre and at times through that compelling. It is almost like if you remade the first movie but took away everything that people liked about it and only left the slice-of-life camp stuff. The story here mirrors the first one, in at least an interesting way. One could potentially argue that they are trying something new here that fits within and expands the boundaries of what a Sleepaway Camp movie can be, but that will live and die by its execution, which sadly, in my opinion, this falters at. It can almost somewhat be described as to what Lucas was attempting to do with the prequels, in that it is a vast departure in what one may expect from this franchise, and is an original concept, but still does not do a good job at executing that original idea. So the story this time tells of Alan, a kid at summer camp who falls into the category of that type of child, who is kind of sad but also deeply unlikable and annoying to be around in just about every conceivable way. He's selfish. He's a bully in his own right. He lashes out. He does not yet know or understand anything about who he is himself on a fundamental level. He's loud. He does not fit in because of his weight and immaturity compared to those around him. He thinks he's funny when he's far from it. And because of this, the kids at the camp hate him and relentlessly torture him. Starting with small little things but escalating in time to be quite extreme and severe. All the while, people at the camp who are mean to him start to die in mysteriously close ways that are somewhat reminiscent to what happened back at Camp Arawak all those years ago. And in the midst of this, a mustachioed, goofy sheriff who speaks with an electrolarynx machine starts to investigate what is exactly going on here. The torment by the other children climaxes with them tricking Alan into going into a dark area where his crush is supposedly waiting for him, mirroring Paul going down to that fateful beach back in the 70s. In the dark, they beat him. They strip him of his clothes and parade him in his briefs on a stage out in front of the entire camp for everybody to see. In this, it is also a bit of a soft remake of Carrie, with the general styling aesthetics of a Sleepaway Camp film. And this isn't subtle. There's actually even a character named Carrie in this. But all of this serves as a misdirection that we will get into in a moment. The film obviously wants you to think that we are building to a climax, where Alan goes postal on all of the bullies who have made his summer a living hell. They clearly want us to think that he has been doing the killing so far in secret out of revenge for how he has been treated. And a smarter movie might have played into those tropes and just told a competent story, but that is not what happens here. The tone of this is all over the place. This is an issue with the original, sure, but it had an amateur craftsmanship enduring quality to it that is just totally absent here. This whole thing just kind of feels like a YouTube skit rather than an actual film. What might have been cute before is kind of sad and annoying here. And I know this sounds bad, but most of this just stems from us having to spend time with Alan. Like, the point of the movie is that even though he is immature and annoying, that he doesn't deserve this kind of hostile negative attention, which is true. But that also means that we have to spend a whole movie with this off-brand Josh Peck, who is pretty insufferable and just brings the whole thing down into this weird sitcom-esque vibe that is just awful to be around for more than 3 minutes. There's a few moments in this movie where there's an honest-to-God fucking laugh track that gets used after our main character yells his deeply unfunny catchphrase, which gets said at least 7 times throughout the film. Your ass stinks. There's also just like a lot of weird meta humor in this in the casting alone, which isn't out of character for the franchise, but is a little bit strange. This is the last film of Isaac Hayes, who's playing the cook at the camp, almost certainly riffing on the fact that he was at this point in his career culturally known for his role as chef in South Park. Here he's almost certainly intended to be playing the son of the cook from the first camp, who was actually played by Robert Earl Jones, the father of James Earl Jones. Vincent Pastore of The Sopranos fame is also in this, essentially just playing a what-if scenario of what if his role from that show, Big Pussy, was a summer camp manager. And they even have Alan at one point call him a big pussy, which I bet as an actor who was severely typecast as this very specific type of character, he loved having a joke about that worked into the script. The male-focused lens from the first film is here again to a degree, but honestly is extremely uncomfortable this time around, and for the most part is very inappropriate. Instead of filming men in their 20s pretending to be teenagers in skimpy shorts like he did the first time, in this, Hilsik is using the same liberal use of casual nudity except with actual teenagers and kids, and it is generally just deeply unpleasant in a 1970s kind of way. You know, this is an uncomfortable conversation to have, but there are aspects of this kind of thing that are done well enough in a naturalistic style, that has an earnest honesty to it in other works such as like Moonrise Kingdom. Like, I don't think that I've ever heard a genuine argument that holds weight that that film is in any way pedophilic. It is naturalistic in how it is displaying the coming-of-age connection between these two young people, but it is certainly not intended to be titillating to the audience. Wes Anderson isn't showing you these things and then nudging you with his elbow and giving you a smiling, side-eyed look of a creep. It is emotionally honest, but it's not horny. And I think there is a difference between something like that and what is happening here in this film. And like, you know, I was in Scouts. I went to these kinds of camps all the time, and this sort of bonding and comfort does happen. That's just a fact of life. But there's a bit of a line there on if these things should be shown within art. And if we do present them, then I think the questions have to be asked about our motivations there as to why we're showing it, and also how we're showing it. And there is a bit of that here as far as like trying to build character is concerned, but honestly the tone of most of it is kind of vulgar and very off-putting, at least to me, even though it doesn't pop up a whole lot. Our story builds more and more here, recreating similar kills from part 1. In this series, everyone gets killed for being bullies or morally corrupt, but in this one they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel, such as one boy who likes to torture frogs by skinning them alive, and so the killer skins him alive. So while everyone becomes more and more suspicious of Alan, he hides out in the woods and the adults are looking for him, eventually catching back up with him as they all discover the skinned boy at the same time. And in that moment, the sheriff drops his vocal device and pulls his face off Scooby-Doo style to reveal that he has been Angela in disguise the whole time. She cackles maniacally to mimic the end of the first film, and then we cut to the credits, with her only being in one shot proper, which is about the strangest decision that you could go with in my opinion for a sequel like this. Talk about wasting an opportunity. They had their lead actress from the first movie on set the whole time and decided somehow that she would bring the most value to this by being hidden under a silly mustache and a fake nose in every scene that she's in. Easily a top 10 weirdest horror filmmaking decision that I've ever seen. I just can't understand it. The definition of wasted potential. Plans were then made by Hilsik to make another sequel slated for a 2011 release that was to be titled A Return to Sleepaway Camp Reunion, but this never saw the light of day and quietly disappeared. Despite not owning the rights, Michael A. Simpson, who directed parts 2 and 3, also seemingly in this time was trying to develop another rival Sleepaway Camp movie that would have brought back Springsteen called Sleepaway Camp Berserk, which would have added a supernatural element to the story, but this similarly never got made. I cannot find the script for this, but based on what I have read about it from people who have read it, it would have focused on Angela, who has, after the events of 3, been living in the woods near the camp and has gone completely feral. She's in her 40s, and would have been presented as actually scary and upsetting. The humor of 2 and 3 was seemingly almost completely absent from this script. It was described as very gritty and realistic, which is kind of a bizarre direction to take something like this that was essentially a cartoon. But I guess I would just have to see the execution of it to know if the vision was just there or not. The next year, in 2009, while not getting an official movie, we did get something which should be mentioned here called Caesar and Otto Summer Camp Massacre, which was a non-official sequel and parody of Sleepaway Camp that even has Felicia Rose in it, which is notable to mention here because it is more warmly regarded within the canon of Sleepaway Camp movies than the actual sequel of Return to Sleepaway Camp is, but that doesn't mean that it is good at all. It kind of screams like one of those movies that you would find on Amazon Prime that was made for like $500 and has absolutely just zero production values, artistic merit, or style, and to me is just kind of unwatchable and shouldn't have more time dedicated to it here outside of what I've already just mentioned. And with that, sadly, comes the last entry in the series, Sleepaway Camp 4: The Survivor, which is one of the worst films that you will ever see. To even call it a film is a bit of a stretch because it really isn't one, and should have never been released for people to pay actual money for it, as more than anything, it is essentially like a bonus feature on a Blu-ray, but was sold by itself at full price. So, you remember in older TV shows where they had to make 20 plus episodes a year? They would do those awful clip show episodes, occasionally about the characters reminiscing on past events that happened in other episodes to save, time and money. This is the movie version of that. It is 70 minutes long, and only a fraction of it is new footage. So the story behind this is that back in 1993, as you will remember, I said that they started developing a fourth Sleepaway Camp movie, but that the production company Double Helix Films closed before it could be completed. Well, before they closed in 1993, they filmed approximately 34 minutes of footage. And in 2012, to make a quick buck, or probably publicly in the name of preservation, whoever owned the rights to this footage cut it into scenes from the first 3 movies, and then tried to form a somewhat narrative and sold it on DVD as Sleepaway Camp 4. It is completely nonsensical, impossible to follow, and is a non-movie in every sense of the word, and won't be talked about here further outside of a single detail that I do find interesting. And that the killer this time around is a woman named Allison, who is in fact Angela from the first 3 movies, who has had a mental breakdown and created this new identity, where she doesn't remember any of those awful and horrible things that she did in those first 3 films. She starts the film suffering from amnesia. And what I find interesting in this is that Angela creates a whole new persona for herself that is also a woman, which could be tied back into the question on her being trans, and how that was an identity that was forced upon her that she seemingly has become comfortable with and conformed to. Again, they were not trying to make an intelligent comment here on the nature of gender in Sleepaway Camp 4, but I think a conversation about Angela's forced transition in the first film can somewhat be expanded upon and how the sequels decide to both ignore and interact with that most iconic aspect of that first movie. Like, I think it is at least interesting that Angela masquerades as a man for the entirety of Return to Sleepaway Camp, even having particularly masculine traits in that drag performance that she's doing, such as a mustache. And that leaves us here today with no new movies in quite a long time, which is both fine and kind of unfortunate to me in a way. I love summer camp slasher movies, and they essentially don't really exist anymore, and I also get why. Making them today would entirely be leaning on nostalgia, which I usually hate, and is deeply rooted in most of the negative media impacts that we have going on today. But that's the thing about nostalgia. It affects everyone, even when you recognize its toxic realities. It is something that I can myself sometimes fall victim to. I do miss that time of endless dumb slasher movies, even though I wasn't even alive during the boom of them. It is a time that exists for me entirely within fantasy, with movies that might not have been great or even particularly very good, but were entertaining enough to watch when a new one came out. And I think the Angela of 2 and 3 was perfect to hold an 8+ movie series off of, which obviously never came to be. The original film has been ripped off many times in the form of pseudo-sequels such as 2020's Sleepaway Camp Slasher. And I just feel like there was an opportunity here that was never quite materialized in a way that was satisfying for anybody involved. Several reboots have been publicly mentioned and floated. Most recently, Felicia Rose said in 2020, "I will say this, because there's been so much looking around the Sleepaway Camp universe for so long. Will they remake it? Will there be another sequel? I know that something's in the works. I don't even really know exactly how it will be, but I can tell you that definitely we just had our 37th anniversary. I would love to say that, mark my words, by the 40th, something will be out. But that 40th anniversary has now come and gone, and we've not seen anything yet. So we will see if this franchise will one day be revived, or if it will fade into the memory of a horrible late-night lakeside scream, birthed from a deep inner pain of contradictions from a forced identity all those years ago."
Shouting in the air with